Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone. My name is Michał Choiński, and I teach American literature and culture at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And I have a great pleasure of moderating today's meeting with a very special guest of the US Consulate in Krakow, Mary Elliot. Mary Elliot is a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where she was involved in the research, conceptualization, design of the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. She's also team member of the museum's Center for the Study of Global Slavery. Prior to that, she served as a consultant to various organizations, including National Visionary Leadership Project, Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the Humanities Council in Washington, D.C. She has over 20 years of experience in researching and presenting African American history and culture. Today's meeting is organized by the U.S. General Consulate in Krakow, and I welcome students from different universities and as well as members or as well as faculty members from different institutes of English and American Studies. Let me say a few words about the format of the meeting. So we'll begin with a presentation. Mary will talk for about 20 minutes discussing the exhibition, and then we'll follow with a Q&A session. You can ask questions in Polish or in English via chat. I'll be happy to translate questions from Polish into English. And the meeting should take altogether about 60 minutes. Over to Mary now.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Michał. And thank you to Amy Steinman and all of your colleagues with the U.S. General Consulate in Krakow for the invitation, generous invitation to present to you all this evening. And it's really my pleasure. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about the museum and our curatorial approach to creating the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. So bear with me, I'm gonna pull up my slide presentation. All right, so again, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to share with you today a little bit about creating the Slavery and Freedom exhibition in the 21st Century Museum. So really what we did to think about how we talk about slavery and freedom, particularly when we opened the museum in 2016. This is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is the 19th museum in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. Our founding director, Lonnie Bunch, is now the first African American secretary of the Smithsonian. And we are excited about our recently positioned new director. His name is Kevin Young, who is joining us from the Schomburg Museum. He is a poet and an amazing scholar, and he is our Andrew Mellon Endowed Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So let me share with you that the museum itself, the idea of it, came into being in 1916, 100+ years ago. There were a group of African American men who fought in the Civil War, who decided that it was time for the nation to look at the contributions of African Americans, particularly in the military, to help create this nation, bring it into being, fight for freedom and democracy, including as far back as the French and Indian War, as far back as the Revolutionary War. And the notion was to create this monument that would include a library, a museum, and other features. It took 100 years for this to come into fruition. It was a bill that was signed by the president, George W. Bush. And when we ultimately cut the ribbon was cut by President Barack Obama. And so we were honored to be able to have our groundbreaking in 2012 and then ultimately open in 2016. The museum has a visitorship daily when we were open, and we will reopen this month. But it has a visitorship of 7,000 visitors per day. Our average dwelling time is 6 hours. Most museums, it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours. but our visitors are reading every label. One of the things we talked about with the designers is we talked about word count. How many words do you put in a label? Because we know that people weren't going to read a book on a wall, but it turns out it's quite amazing when you walk through the exhibitions. It almost feels like you're in a book club with a group of people reading all of this content and saying, how come we didn't know this? So much rich information, and the diversity of our audience, Black, white, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, young, old, you name it. And so everyone is learning together. We're all on this journey together. To date, we've had over 7 million people visit the museum. We've received several awards, including architectural design awards, educational tool awards, and so much more. We recently, this past year, in 2020, actually, we launched the Talking About Race web portal, and that was recently nominated for an award as well. And when you come to visit the museum, you absolutely must visit our restaurant, because that is curated just as much as the exhibitions. So what's the vision of the museum? Well, there are a few key points. We want to explore and celebrate African-American history and culture and community. We also use the African-American narrative as a lens to provide a more nuanced and powerful understanding of the American experience. This is an American story. And we tell the African-American story in an international context. We look at the diaspora, and we look at all these other regions throughout the world that have connections to what became the United States and the lived experiences of Black people in the United States. But also, and equally important for today, is this 21st century museum serving as a model for collaboration, dialogue, and reconciliation. I can't emphasize that enough. Collaboration, dialogue, and reconciliation. How do you get people to talk about subjects they might not otherwise discuss? But if you use an object, and that object, as I mentioned, people standing next to each other, looking at the same object, having different thoughts, and turning to each other and talking in ways that they might not otherwise have done. And so it's very important to look at what can we do as a museum to help facilitate some of those conversations, to help work towards building a more thoughtful, engaged public, so that as they go forward, they make thoughtful decisions, and also to create a more collaborative experience. So this is a model of the museum, a drawing of the museum. And I'm gonna move my cursor, hopefully you can see it. But here on the top level, this is where our offices are. This is where you enter the museum. This design feature here is supposed to look like a porch. And a porch you would often see on the porches down in South Carolina, where many people in the African-American community would gather in the morning or in the evening to talk about their day, to talk about life. But also that transcends just the African-American community. It goes to many other communities, and it goes beyond just the South, because you think about people who gather on the front stoops at homes in Baltimore and Philadelphia and other places, and it's a gathering place. And so this porch design is a drawing point to get people to come in and really think about visiting the museum, but also just as they're gathering and queuing up to go inside the museum, to prompt them to just kind of exchange and conversation with one another. It's a communal site. As you enter the museum, this is our Heritage Hall, where you gather information regarding where to go in the museum. We have volunteers, we have our museum store as well, and we have an orientation film. And then as you make your way up, the second floor is our Education Commons area, which includes a family history center and a center for African-American media and arts, and a lot of interactive activities for young people and older folks alike. Our third level is the level for our community galleries, which includes the theme on sports. It includes the exhibition on the power of place, sites of significance to all African Americans and many Americans across the nation, including sites like the Chicago Defender newspaper offices, a hat shop in Philadelphia founded by an African American woman in the early 20th century, as well as a story on the Bronx, the birthplace of hip hop. And then another story, which is very important, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, which we're getting ready to commemorate the 100th anniversary of this month. And on the fourth floor, we have the exhibitions related to culture. Those exhibitions include visual arts, It includes Taking the Stage. It includes Musical Crossroads, and then our culture exhibition, which looks at our literacy work. It looks at our foodways. It looks at our craftsmanship and so much more. And I should also mention on the third level in the community gallery, we feature the exhibition on military and the exhibition on making a way out of no way. What are those pillars that helped African Americans survive in a racist and segregated United States? And pillars that are still important to the community today: education, civic engagement, entrepreneurship, and so many more things, activism. And so as we go down, you see this is the history gallery. In the history gallery, we have on the third level, the very bottom level, is the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, foundational at the heart of the museum. The second level is segregation, where we look at the end of Reconstruction all the way to the modern civil rights era. And then the top first level is making Changing America. A Changing America looks at after Martin Luther King was assassinated all the way through to today. So this is an image inside the exhibition, inside the history gallery. Here is where people queue up to get ready to take an elevator down back in time. And on the bottom level, you see the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. Here's the Segregation Gallery, and here is a Changing America. Let me share a little bit about how we look out over this vista and what it tells us. Here you have this Tower of Cotton, which is symbolic of after the end of the international slave trade from the US side, the importance of the domestic slave trade kicks up because cotton becomes king. And so we look at how people from the upper South are moved to the lower South and the role that cotton plays to make the United States become this economic powerhouse based on the labor of enslaved African Americans. But right across from that Tower of Cotton, you see the slave cabin from Edisto Island, South Carolina, built in the 1850s. On the front end, we interpret that cabin and we look at the story of slavery and freedom, but particularly slavery. And then on the back end, we look at the story of freedom. Why? Because this is where we interpret the story of emancipation and the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. We also look at the story of Reconstruction. We look at Reconstruction and consider the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery with the exception of if you commit a crime. The 14th Amendment, citizenship, due process, and the equal protection under the law. And then the 15th Amendment, we look at voting rights and the right to run for office. But I want to point something out to you. If you look under this ledge, this is where we interpret the story of the domestic slave trade. The domestic slave trade is the period when Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, the most significant domestic slave traders during the period, made their profit. Isaac Franklin turned his profit into power and bought 8 plantations during the period before slavery ended. Now keep this in mind. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment ends slavery with the exception of if you commit a crime. As you make your way up to the Segregation Gallery, you see this guard tower from Angola Prison. Angola Prison is one of the worst prisons in the United States. Angola Prison is on the site of the former Angola Plantation. Angola Prison and that guard tower allows us to talk about the convict lease labor system. Keep in mind the 13th Amendment, slavery ends. You have a choice. You either get into a sharecropper's contract and you're now working back out in those same fields. You're now living back in those same slave cabins. You are hoping you get paid the right amount of money at the end of the season, cultivating those crops. You hope that you're not in debt because you're buying everything on credit, or else you try and make your own way in the world. And while you're trying to make your own way in the world during this Reconstruction period, and we see during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, these laws on the books that restrict your freedom. During Reconstruction, the Mississippi codes, for example, the vagrancy laws, the Black codes. So you try and get on with your life and someone picks you up and says you're a vagrant, puts you in jail, and you're back out in those fields working those crops. And that again gets us to that convict lease labor system. And so we go from slavery and freedom up to this convict lease labor system. And again, that story of Angola Prison on the side of Angola Plantation. Angola Plantation was one of the 8 plantations owned by Isaac Franklin. As you make your way down into the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, we start with the quote from the renowned historian John Hope Franklin. We've got to tell the unvarnished truth. We do not hold back telling the story of slavery and freedom in this museum or any other stories we tell in this museum. The exhibition for Slavery and Freedom includes a 300-page script, which is footnoted because we knew people would question things, challenge things. And so we made sure we documented everything is steeped in scholarship. This is the interpretive lens we use when we think about this history and tell this story. It's an American story told through the African-American lens. It's a human story and a shared story. Slavery was foundational to the development of the modern world and the nation. We provide first-person accounts giving voice to African-Americans, people of African descent. So many people told us, you're not going to be able to find quotes or be able to really get at how people felt. But in fact, we found many different ways to share those stories, including narratives and other sources, other archival sources. We use maritime archaeology, our terrestrial archaeology, oral history, and more. We also look at the hardship and struggle, as well as resistance, resilience, and survival. We look at how people held on to their humanity under inhumane conditions. We look at the juxtapositions of profit and power against the human cost. And we look at how people of African descent, African Americans, shaped and were shaped by the landscape, socially, politically, culturally, economically, physically, intellectually, and one can add spiritually. The lens we use is we have through lines that look at resistance and resilience. If all we talked about was the horrors of slavery, we would be missing the mark. We cannot dismiss the traumatic experience of slavery, but we cannot leave out the story of resistance and resilience and that human spirit. We look at diasporic connections. We look at stories of gender, faith, identity, and race. So this is what most people think of when they think of slavery in the United States. People call it the big house, the house you see in the background. We refer to it as the main plantation home. And you see this image, the emphasis is on the wealth and the landscape, but this is what we want you to see, the people. We draw you in to see the people who helped to build that landscape, the people who helped to build the wealth in this nation, the people who came in and cleared and improved this land. We look at the people whose culture contributed to this nation. How do we give voice to diverse perspectives and illuminate the story of those who have historically been marginalized? We'll go through that, as I'll explain through this presentation. What stories come forward, who gets to tell the story, and how do we connect diverse audiences on a human level, interracial audiences, intergenerational audiences, a global audience. One of the design treatments we did, we start with, for example, the story of Queen Nzinga. We had to anticipate the questions people would ask going into the exhibition. Some of the things that we knew people would talk about was, I thought people of African descent enslaved other people of African descent. Queen Nzinga gives us a very nuanced story. Here's this woman, a leader in an area now known as Angola, who was very strategic in her relationships to avoid her own people from being enslaved. But she also made some hard choices, including being involved in the slave trade, as well as harboring people who were running from slave catchers. She aligned with the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Catholic Church. In the end, all three of those turned against her. And so we talk about her story. It helps us unpack some of those questions. Also, we look at the fact that many people of African descent who engaged in the slave trade did so, whether, again, like her, to avoid their own people from being enslaved, whether it was to pay off debt, whether it was as a result of warfare, or whether it was simply because they wanted to make profit. And then we pair it with this excerpt from an abolitionist poem. I admit that I am sickened at the purchase of slaves, but I must be mum, for how would we do without sugar or rum? We want people, as soon as they start on this journey with us, to think about the moral obligation we have to one another. What are the things we sacrifice just for that almighty commodity? In this case, we are talking about that human cost. This poem was written by William Cowpen as an effort to appeal to women in the households who were purchasing sugar during the early period. Sugar, of course, being the driver of the trade during that transatlantic slave trade period. We also look at design in terms of how do you talk about profit and power and the human cost. This is a case that shows a rustic sugar pot used on a plantation to boil down sugar cane, surrounded by faux sugar and surrounded by ornate silver objects related to sugar during the period. And so you see a teapot, a sugar bowl, sugar tongs. We have a bonbonniere that held sweets. And the design approach was to surround these ornate objects that speak to the commercial trade of sugar and juxtapose it against the human cost. But as you read the label, you find out all of these different statistics that talk about the cost that went into producing the sugar on these plantation sites in the Western Atlantic world, including the fact that enslaved people who worked in sugar plantations had a 7-year life expectancy. And then we come into the space on the Middle Passage. What you see here is a space design that is what we consider a sacred space. We used quotes, and those quotes, remember we talked about how do you pull in all these different voices, but still foreground the voices of people of African descent. In this space, we were able to think about the experience on the Middle Passage, and instead of fabricating an experience, we wouldn't do a disservice to those who went through the Middle Passage, even trying to think that we could get people to know what it felt like. Instead, we use quotes from observers and people who actually recounted their experience in the Middle Passage, including Laura Aquilano. Here you see artifacts from the São José, a slave ship that crashed off the coast of South Africa, started in Lisbon, went to Mozambique, picked up captive people of African descent, was on its way to Brazil to place them into enslavement in Brazil, and it crashed off the coast of South Africa. Of the 400 plus people on board the ship who were bound to be enslaved in South America, 200 died, but 200 were saved merely because they were property and therefore profit. And so you see a piece of wood from the ship and a ballast stone from the ship. This ballast stone was a marker to help us know that when we looked for the crashed slave ship through the Slave Wrecks Project, we were able to identify the site because the archival records told us that in fact, the ship had 1,400 ballast stones aboard the ship. The ballast stones, of course, used to offset the human weight so the ship wouldn't turn over. And so we were able to identify this site and to pull up these artifacts from the ocean floor and display them in the museum. They are on loan to us from Ezekiel Museum, one of our partners in the Slave Wrecks Project. This quote is from a captain who served on a slave ship who talks about what he observed while serving during the Middle Passage. And then we have to think about how do you get people to understand the expanse of this enterprise of slavery? And so we wallpapered the wall with names of ships, only a few hundred of the ships that crossed the Atlantic of the 40,000 plus. So we included about 400 ships on the wall, but look at the entries. We have the name of the ship, the country of origin, the date of embarkation, how many were boarded, and how many offloaded to show that 20% mortality rate. Oftentimes people go up to the wall and they look for their own countries. They look at the names of the ship, like the Africa packet, the Excellent, and then they look at the mortality rates. 425 boarded, 176 survived. When we talk about telling the humanity of this story, looking at the human cost, we don't just look at people of African descent, but we foreground people of African descent, but everyone has a story. So here you have Fox's Wage Book. That wages book is the book that shows the wages that were paid to crew members who served on a slave ship. We asked people to think about why would someone serve on a slave ship? Because the conditions were horrific. Even crew members were beaten on those slave ships, starved oftentimes as well. And so we asked, why would someone serve on a slave ship? Was it to gain passage to the Western Atlantic world? Was it to feed their family? Or was it simply because they wanted to make money? When you open up that book, you find out many of those crew members ran away or committed suicide. And then we look at women and their role during all of these periods, from the transatlantic slave trade period, you saw we talked about Queen Nzinga, all the way through the Revolutionary period, through to Reconstruction. Here we look at Phyllis Wheatley through a different lens, not just through her poetic voice, but here she's writing a letter to a Native American minister, Samson Acom. And she's calling out the patriots during the Revolutionary period. And she talks about how the patriots are fighting for independence, for liberty, for freedom, while maintaining slavery. And so she says, in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. We use cast figures to help us humanize some of the people whose stories we tell. Here's a platform on the paradox of liberty, looking at a nation that fought for independence but maintained slavery. What you see on this platform is, in the foreground, we have Thomas Jefferson, representative of many of the presidents who served during the Revolutionary period, the early period of the nation, many of them having owned enslaved people. Behind him are 600 bricks representing the 600 people he owned over his lifetime. And the paradox of this nation fighting for freedom but maintaining slavery. Beside him, alongside of him, right behind him, are Benjamin Banneker, Toussaint Louverture, and behind those bricks, we also have cast figures of Mumbet, an African-American woman who fought for her freedom in Massachusetts and won, and Phyllis Wheatley, who was a voice of freedom in the nation as well. And so this platform allows us to look at these voices of freedom. When we had the cast figure design for Thomas Jefferson, we told the designers, we wanted to make sure that people could encounter him and really think about what would they do if they were him. And we made sure that they did not create a cast figure where so often you see him looking like Superman. When they sent us back the cast figure they initially designed based on our character study, it seemed as if they didn't hear what we were saying. And they sent us this figure of Thomas Jefferson with his arms up, his collar up to his ears, his hair flowing in the wind, and he looked like Superman. And we told them to dial it back. We needed our visitors to encounter him on a human level, on a level that they could think of themselves in his role. What would they have done? And so they reconfigured him, and this is who we have now. And then we look at the laws, how the laws shaped slavery in the nation. And so we have these cases, including the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, but the laws go all the way along the wall. And all of these laws foundational to the development of the nation, but steeped in slavery, even without using the words slavery, with the exception of a few using the words the Fugitive Slave Act. But we look at the end of the engagement in the international slave trade, 1808 Act. We look at the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, the expansion of the nation, which allowed us to expand our involvement in cultivating sugar and cotton and more. And we look at the 1820, 1850 Compromise, the Dred Scott decisions, all the way down through the Reconstruction Amendments. But what we did, again, bringing African-American voices forward, is for every legislation, we have African-American voices speaking back in the form of speeches, in the form of sermons, in the form of newspaper articles, to show that all along the way, African-Americans forced their voices into the public arena to push for freedom for all. We look at human suffering and the power of the human spirit. Here we have an example of, we have the auction block, which was acquired from Hagerstown, Maryland. And then we also have a whip, symbolic of the brutality of slavery during this period. As well, we have these drums, rada drums, that would have been they are of the type that would have been used during the Haitian Revolution. That fight for freedom, that successful fight for freedom, Black power down in the Caribbean. And then we also have this image that you see is the contraband camp tent, which is actually mounted. It was mounted in the exhibition. It's no longer up because we had it on loan for quite some time, and we're grateful to the National Park Service. But the contraband camp tent represents the story of the contrabands. And I say that in quotes because these are African-American people who, upon the implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation and the understanding that if African Americans could make their way to the Union Army campsites, they could gain their freedom. And so many African Americans fled to the Union Army campsites, and there they were able to gain their freedom as the Confederates demanded the return of their property, and the Union Army said property, therefore contraband of war, we're not returning anyone. And so you see these contraband campsites pop up across the South and throughout places including DC, which is of course below the Mason-Dixon line. And so this story talks about the power of the human spirit, not only seizing one's freedom, but also in doing so, and with the help of Frederick Douglass, pushing for African-American men to be able to fight in the Civil War and changing a fight to keep the Union together to a fight for freedom. We use Ancestral Voices. Here we have an image of Elaine Thompson. She is the descendant of Joseph Trammell. She contacted us and she said, I have something I think the museum should have. And we literally changed our exhibition design to include this very important artifact. We were basically done and building the exhibition, but we went back to the drawing board because it was so important to include this. Elaine Thompson's ancestor, Joseph Trammell, was free in Loudoun County, Virginia. What you see here are his original freedom papers from 1952. He had to register his freedom every 2 years in Loudoun County, Virginia. And in doing so, he had to have a white person account for his character. And so this document tells us so much. It talks about his physical description. It tells us where he was. It tells us he had to register for his freedom. It also tells us who stood in as a witness on his behalf. And that tin wallet was designed by Joseph Trammell to protect his freedom in essence, because that tin wallet protected those freedom papers. Why was that important? If they got wet, if they got stolen, if they got torn, destroyed in any way, Joseph Trammell, if he could not present those freedom papers, could be put up on the auction block at any time. Any person, a young white person to a government official, could accuse him of being a fugitive enslaved person. And if he couldn't prove that freedom, he could stand the chance of being enslaved. And so we're very honored that Elaine Thompson brought this to our attention. She was the last steward of this very important family artifact. Here you see her being interviewed by CBS News, and it was an honor to see her be able to see this artifact placed in the museum. Sadly, she died a month after we opened. We also look at some of the stories that oftentimes, I mean, a lot of these stories can feel like they're hard history, hard to talk about, but our visitors really do take time and are immersed in this history, and they're learning so much about the nation and about the power of the people and the strength of the nation, even though this nation went through and continues to go through a lot of changes. But again, this is designed to help us be thoughtful about how we move forward. So here we have the Bible from Nat Turner. Nat Turner, a gentleman who was responsible for a rebellion down in Southern Virginia. And Nat Turner, the rebellion occurred in 1831. He was taken into custody and he had this Bible, but Nat Turner was a literate, enslaved man who preached to interracial congregations, but he relied on the Bible as the impetus for his notions of freedom. In an article that I wrote for the 1619 Project, the New York Times 1619 Project, I refer to this as liberation theology in some sense. And so this Bible was actually given to the family of one of the enslavers who was saved by an enslaved person during this rebellion. And so we were honored to be able to get this Bible, to be able to share the story of Nat Turner. I'm going to do a time check real quick. Could you tell me how much time I have left?
Well, it would be great if we could move forward with the next, with a few next items,
Okay.
because I know I already have a few questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are more.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and wrap up. So this is, and thank you so much. This is the Bible from Nat Turner. It allows us to tell this story. The slave cabin you see is the slave cabin I referred to earlier. This is from Edisto Island, South Carolina, Pointed Pines Plantation, which was donated by the descendants of the enslaving family. And here we have the hymnal from the iconic Harriet Tubman. We were able to acquire several artifacts of hers from a family member. This is the wall where we look at the entries of many of the names of people on bills of sales and broadsides during the domestic slave trade. And we highlight some of the key words, including talking about their names, and we talk about their ages, and we talk about things like and their future increase to show the value of a woman based on her ability to give birth to the next generation of enslaved people. We also look at the WPA narratives that were recorded during the 1930s, where people recounted what slavery was like during the period. Here you see additional excerpts from some of these bills of sale. Old Ned, $11, regarding his age and devaluing him. And then we see this excerpt from a will. For my fourth son, for his better support and advancement through life, I do hereby give 2 Negro slaves with their future increase. And so we look at the legacy of here a son is gaining wealth based on his ownership of 2 small children, while those 2 small children, they are enslaved by his family. And here you see the auction block surrounded by information regarding the profit and power of the trade and the human cost. Again, that same quote. We looked at the story of enslaved African Americans through the lens of life, work, and enslavement. This is Solomon Williams, who was enslaved on a plantation in New Orleans, in Louisiana. He created this double helix drill bit without any education as an enslaved blacksmith. He used those same skills to create this ornate grave marker for his wife and dozens others. And then as an enslaved man, he was responsible as a blacksmith to create the restraints on the plantation. This allows us to look at life, work, and enslavement to give layers to his story. We use poetry, including this excerpt from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's poem on the slave auction. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries while tyrants bartered them for gold. And then lastly, we look at how we engage in collecting through community engagement. And here you see the descendant community down in South Carolina with colleagues as we collected the slave cabin. During that time, the community came out every day for a week as we dismantled the slave cabin to have it conserved and then ultimately brought to the museum and placed on display. This woman in Black, she actually lived in the cabin during a period. The cabin was constructed in 1850 and lived in until 1981. And then we end on the story of Reconstruction, looking at the importance of the infrastructure of the churches, the development of educational institutions, the importance of African Americans running for and holding office and using their right to vote. And we look at the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And finally, this gives you a sense of inside the museum as you come through looking at all of this history and really thinking through all of what the nation has been through. We created a space for people to be able to just sit and pause and reflect and catch their breath. And this is our reflection room that has an inside waterfall, and it's dedicated to John Hope Franklin, whom I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And lastly, this is an image of my family. They were from Oklahoma, and this is a picture of my cousin who came up from Ecuador. And so why do we do all of this? Because it's important for the next generation to be able to touch this history, know about this history, learn from this history, and grow from it. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure to present for you, and I'm open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That's been that's an incredible introduction. We felt as if we've been in the museum with you, as it were. Although it's hard to look at some of these items, knowing the gravity, right, that they carry. I already have a queue of 3 questions, and I encourage the members of our audience to send me further questions. I'll take the liberty of asking the first question, if I may. I wanted to ask you about the plantations, especially in the American South. We talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, we talked about Alley Plantation, right, in Louisiana, and we talked about the duality of that site, which on the one hand presents a beautiful, beautiful place that you go to take selfies, that you go to get married. The plantation is quite often rented for marriage ceremonies. And it's a glorious house with a glorious oak alley. And on the other hand, you do have slave quarters behind this house. And the members of the audience will know it probably. That was the site where an interview with the vampire, the movie, was shot, among others, and many other of famous movies. So I remember when I visited the plantation, I had I felt this paradox of the place. So I wanted you to very briefly comment on these sites, especially in the American South. How do you deal with them as a historian in terms of historical awareness?
Well, I'm glad you framed it as the American South, but the truth is these sites are all over. So if you go into Washington, D.C., and you look in the urban environment, and behind some of the homes on Capitol Hill, there are places that were considered slave dwelling sites. Georgetown was a site of enslavement as well. And so it's important to think about all of this, how we interpret the landscape completely, whether it's down south or in the north, right? And so when it comes to places like Oak Alley and Whitney Plantation and Evergreen Plantation. Evergreen Plantation is the site where they filmed the movie Django Unchained. And if any of you all remember that movie, there's a scene where there's this sweeping plantation site and you see all of these people working in the fields and the slave cabins. What's really powerful about that, I had the opportunity to visit that site, and there are 24 intact slave cabins. They call that a slave street. And the woman who interprets that site, her name is Jane, and she had me start at the top of the slave street and just walk down along it without speaking. And she said, just listen to the environment and imagine what it was like. She didn't fabricate anything. She simply said, just pay attention to the environment and think about what it was like. Off to the side were the fields. And beyond the fields was an overgrown brush near some trees. And she pointed out that that's the burial ground. When you go to Whitney Plantation, the gentleman there places emphasis on the brutality of slavery. And there's all these different ways that people interpret slavery. And so for me, when I look at the Whitney Plantation, I think to myself, there are many African Americans who want to have a touchstone where they can go, look what happened, look what happened. At the same time, for us in the museum, it's imperative to look at what happened to people, but what people also did. Because if I had a young child go through and only look at the horrors of slavery, what good would I do for them if I don't talk about the resistance and the strength of the people? When we look at these sites, you're right, Michał, that they interpret many of these sites and look at the decorative arts and the design. But the one thing we talk about, when I talked to a young lady who was interpreting history for the Owens Thomas House in Savannah, Georgia, and they interpret it from the slave dwelling site behind the main house, and this is an urban setting. And she interprets the lives of the enslaved from the slave dwelling site, which was people were housed above the horses in the barn, and then they worked down in the bottom part of the main house to do laundry and cooking. And I asked her, why do you only limit your interpretation to those sites? And she said, because that's where they were. And I asked her, well, didn't they go upstairs and serve the food? Didn't they change the linen? Didn't they greet people at the door? Didn't they do the gardening? Yes. So why would you limit interpreting their story merely from the back of the house and under the house? And so now they do a more robust interpretation of the lives of African Americans and how all of these people came together during that period in that site.
Okay, thank you, thank you. The first question is from Marzena Gromotowicz, who asks about NASA's agency, NASA's headquarters in Washington, D.C., which the main building there is named after Mary W. Jackson, the first African-American female engineer at NASA. So Mary W. Jackson was part of a group of very important women who helped NASA succeed in getting American astronauts into space. Is there maybe an exhibition in the museum telling visitors the story of these brave women working for NASA then?
Well, we have many exhibitions, and Slavery and Freedom is one of them, but there are several different exhibitions. So Making a Way Out of No Way is one of those exhibitions that allows us to talk about more contemporary accomplishments of African Americans. And we actually have a curator who is dedicated to looking at innovation and entrepreneurship, and under innovation that allows us to talk about the story of the women. And I'm forgetting the name of the movie that was based on their lives that they contributed to. Amy, you know the name?
Hidden Figures?
Yes, thank you, Hidden Figures. And so we continue to collect around these topics, and we're excited with the Smithsonian. We're excited about the pending opening of the National Museum of Women's History, but it also allows us to highlight women's history within our own museum and the contributions of African American women. So we have a special feature on the National Council of Negro Women, and there's a whole room dedicated to that story, looking at the contributions of African American women, talking about democracy and pushing for freedom and democracy in the nation. But this section on Making a Way Out of No Way is the ideal section for where we would include that story. So as we continue to get objects in, those stories are elevated, and we rotate objects out and rotate new objects in. So that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question from Krzysztof Gorlach, professor of sociology at the Jagiellonian University, who is very much interested in the management of trauma. And he wanted to ask you about the extent to which the experience of trauma of African-American community plays a vital role in the public sphere in the US right now.
Well, I could tell you the significance of African American trauma and looking at the US right now. If you look at the case with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, I think the best thing I could tell you is right now you're seeing things on video, right? And so when we think about the modern civil rights era and the use of television, and television bringing that the experience of people fighting for equality and justice during the 60s and being faced with a very violent, racist, segregated United States, it was very important that people were able to see this in real time, to be able to see what was actually happening in other jurisdictions. And you can't deny the fact that now we have our phones, and people are recording things, and they're seeing all of what African Americans are talking about, and they're seeing it. It also helps to have a pandemic. Not that we want to go through this, but the pandemic has added to the fact that we are forced in front of our televisions, in front of our computers, and these things are coming up where it has created a larger movement to seek justice and to end the violence in the nation. And it is a traumatic experience for African Americans. But I think that one thing I would point out is, if you look at the recent hearings regarding Derek Chauvin, think about the witnesses who spoke and the diversity of those witnesses. And think about, there was a recent interview of one of the alternative jurors. And she said that for her, it was very compelling to hear people convey their story. And that trauma is not just limited to Black people, but now that trauma is being felt by everybody because of this inhumane activity going on. And it's happening over and over again. As you see, this history ebbs and flows. This is nothing new, but now we're able to see it more directly. I hope that answers that question. Mm-hmm. When Black people talk about the trauma we've been through, and it feels like no one's listening, but it is very clear that the events of this past year, 2020, I think one of the things that stood out most importantly in the United States was the diversity of people who took to the streets and the diversity of people who least expected themselves to speak up, including, as I said, in the Derek Chauvin case, you have police officers who spoke up who might otherwise have said, I never would have expected myself to be here today and speak about this. And so I think that's very important. It's very telling about where we are as a nation and how this trauma is playing out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The next question is from Barbara, who asks about the social impact of your exhibitions at the Smithsonian. So how do you measure that impact, and how do you do this kind of meta research, looking at how the exhibition is viewed by those who visit the museum?
You know, I'd have to check with my colleagues about how they're doing the research, but what I could tell you I could tell you for a fact, our audience member is 40% white. That I do know. So it's not limited to African Americans. The museum is not a Black museum for Black people. It is a story about American history told through the African American lens. And so just as I told you about those pieces of legislation, these are things all of us learn in class every day in elementary school, junior high school. And so now people are looking at these documents in new ways, right? And it's not just Black people, it's everyone learning about why does 1803 Louisiana Purchase really matter in many different ways, right? Not just expanding the nation, but what were the implications of that? And then also listening to our visitors as they come through the museum, as they send us messages. We have a special feature in the exhibitions where people can record their stories about what they thought about the exhibition, what it made them think about in terms of their own stories, their family history. We've seen people come into the museum regardless of political perspective. So we had people who were wearing the Make America Great Again hats, and we have people who are very progressive, who are all talking about, this is what I thought about going through this exhibition. And so I think the most important thing I could say is give people credit that they can actually confront this history, think about this history, and talk to each other. We don't give the public enough credit. And the other thing I would say is a very important measure is educators nonstop are asking, can you do a presentation for us? Can you help us understand how to teach this? And paired with that, our education team is helping educators think about how to talk about race in the classroom. And so it's very, very important.
Thank you. Another question from Adam regarding the debate surrounding the removal and replacement of Confederate monuments. Also on your usage of the phrase interpreting history that Adam has noticed you've been using consistently
Enslaved.
throughout your presentation.
Like when I say enslaved versus slave? Well, is that right, Michał? Is that what you're talking about?
I mean, maybe let us start with the Confederate monuments, because I think that's a vital ongoing debate in the U.S.
Well, I won't give you an answer on the Confederate monuments. I'll say this with regard to the Confederate monuments. In other words, I won't take a stance one way or another, but I will say this. The thing that's important for people to keep in mind, and we talk about this, is the Confederate monuments were created during a time where a narrative was being promoted about Black people. Keep in mind, during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, 1890s to 1915, the Black Nadir, you have the Daughters of the Confederacy creating curriculum that excluded the contributions of African Americans and spoke about African Americans in a way that was degrading and promoted the lost cause. You have Confederate monuments going up in sites, marking the landscape, including in places like Richmond, Virginia, where there is Monument Row. And it was really created identifying that Black people know your place. This is not your place. It was specifically in a particular community, identifying and raising up people who were seen as the heroes of the Civil War and the nation. And so it's a particular narrative that was being promoted. At the same time, you have a gentleman named William Dunning who was promoting the history of Reconstruction, and he was supported by Columbia University and the American Historical Association to talk about Reconstruction and the lost cause, and to paint a picture of African Americans as less than and as in need of the support of smarter white people. And then you also have a president in 1915 who showed the film Birth of a Nation in the White House. This is all together. This cannot be looked at in a vacuum. And it's creating a narrative on the landscape and throughout the nation, one that we've continually had to fight against. And so that's what I will say about those monuments. You can't look at them in a vacuum. It was part and parcel of many things going on to create a certain narrative of the nation.
Thank you. Another question from Elżbieta. Does the museum have some space for visual arts crafted by African Americans, folk art, maybe juxtaposed against what was painted by, for instance, white painters of the same period?
Thank you for that question. We actually do. We have a visual arts gallery, which is absolutely amazing. And it's not broken down by the style of art or the time period. It's broken down by theme. So the themes include faith. The themes include social justice. The themes include community. It's so powerful, and it's done by our visual arts curators. One who's recently retired, Jacqueline Serwer, and then our current chief curator and visual arts curator, Talisa Fleming. Absolutely stunning, and we're excited because we'll be able to show some of the artwork. We already had a piece of art by Amy Sherald, who was also the artist who painted the portrait of First Lady Michelle Obama, but now we are also going to feature art that we jointly acquired, the portrait of Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was killed at the hands of the police. So we're really excited to use that portrait to talk about contemporary issues about social justice. So visual arts it has its own gallery. And then again, in the culture gallery, as I mentioned earlier, we feature craftsmanship of various African Americans, whether it's through the from the blacksmiths to jewelry designers to pottery makers to even the beautiful artistic baskets created by people down in the Low Country, South Carolina region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Another question from Małgorzata will be finishing soon, I guess, concerns all of that effort that went into the design of the exhibition. So what is the expected lifespan of such an exhibition, bearing in mind that that there could be the need to retell the history with every single new generation of visitors?
Well, the good thing is, it took everyone to bring this museum to bear. And I've got to say this to you all. We have artifacts that, for example, there's a red flag that was used. They hung it outside of the slave auction sites, and it told people that enslaved people were ready for sale during that domestic slave trade period. They pinned the day's inventory on that red flag. There's only one still existing red flag that we know of, and it's owned by the South Carolina Historical Society. It's maintained in the Charleston Museum. You saw a clip of it in that picture that I showed of the auction block with the one piece on one side and one on the other. The South Carolina Historical Society loaned that flag to us to put on display. Why am I telling you this? Because there's many different stories about human trauma, atrocities around the world, what people call hard history. But places like South Carolina Historical Society approached us and said, here, take this, put this on display. People need to know this story. This was an object that had not been on display for years. When I say years, decades. And so it was our honor to be able to display it. And they wanted us to display it, particularly in our museum, telling this story about slavery and freedom and a more nuanced, inclusive story, right? I bring this up because that artifact is on loan. It will rotate out. So we have to rotate in new artifacts. And so while our museum inaugural exhibitions are up for close to 20 years, permanent exhibitions, we will continue to rotate objects, whether it's due to a lone object going off display, whether it's due to conservation needs, or whether it's due to because we found something really profound that recently came to us that we need to highlight, like the Howlin' album, which features the earliest known image of Harriet Tubman, which we changed everything around just to feature that particular object.
Mm-hmm. And the last question from Emilia, and I'm very sorry, we do have to wrap the meeting up, concerns language, contemporary African-American variety of language, and spoke to what extent it has been impacted by language rituals, by the language of African-American, of Black slaves.
If I understand the question right,
I guess the question concerns the origins of the contemporary contemporary African American varieties in from the social linguistic point of view.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we recently decided that we would definitely use the word, capitalize the word Black. So we capitalize the word Black in the museum. We also use the word enslaved instead of slave, and enslaver instead of slave owner or slaveholder. One of the things that we thought about in terms of using the word enslaved is that you can own a person's body, right? But not their mind. You don't own them. And so they're enslaved, right? They're not a slave, they're enslaved. And the person who's doing this is an enslaver. And that term enslaver extends beyond plantation owners. Enslavers applies to people engaged in the domestic slave trade. Enslaver applies to people who were leasing out enslaved people. It applies to many different situations. So we at all turns want to give people their humanity. And we want to make sure that people know that because people were enslaved, that doesn't mean they were stripped of their memories, of their culture, of their history. One thing I said with Michał, but when we did a preliminary meeting was, I believe we talked about how if I were to take any one of you all and rip you from your community, from your landscape, from your family, and I were to lock you down in a basement, I don't think you would forget who your grandmother is. I don't think you would forget her recipes. I don't think you would forget your teacher. I don't think you would forget the street you grew up on or the church you attended. So when people were torn from different parts of Africa, particularly that Western region, they didn't come with empty heads, they came with empty hands. And so to use the word enslaved is appropriate. And again, using the word Black, as an African-American person, I also identify with the word Black because it connects me to all the other Black people. That's how I feel. And I also feel very connected to all of you. And I appreciate you all even giving me the time to do this presentation and being sincere in your interest. And I'm excited to see what you do with your own history and talk about how it connects to ours and how it connects to the story of humanity. It's very important. So thank you so much. I look forward to you all coming to the museum.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm very grateful for the U.S. Consulate in Krakow for hosting this meeting.